Talking about one of my favorite topics. Of course, I have a lot of them in this field of exercise, sports science, nutrition science, training science, and that is of the taper. Jason Miller here with a article review, but also kind of weaving in this idea of how to set up appropriate taper for sport performance. And if you're not familiar with what a taper is, the idea is that right before a competition, there'd be some sort of transition in training intensity and volume, some combination of the two, or just maybe one of them, to bring about some recovery that results in peak performance. And if you haven't seen my video on the fitness fatigue model, I would encourage you to go back and look at that. That will explain some of the training theory that's behind what a taper is, and I'll probably talk about it a little bit as well. So I wanted to talk about this article by Travis et al., 2020. It's called Tapering and Peaking Maximum Strength for Powerlifting Performance, a review. A review article, if you're not familiar, is taking in the available literature with potentially some sort of parameters and discussing what the literature has revealed. So this is not a meta-analysis in the sense that it's going to use statistical data in order to figure out where the lines are drawn in, when an effective taper is. And there's only 7 studies as part of this review, and they had a nice inclusion criteria for this. In other words, these people were stronger. And then again, if you forgot the title already, it was about powerlifting. So as an Olympic style weightlifting coach, this is still interesting though. In the book I wrote, which I'm doing an update for, and hopefully be published here in the next few months, I've updated the section on tapering as well, and I talked about tapering as well. I think it's a topic that is not well understood many times, and how to implement it is not well understood. And the second author on the study, Mojica, has a book, Inigo. Inigo, I'm sure I'm going to say this Dr. Mojica's name wrong, so apologies if you ever watch this. I don't know why you would, but he has a book called Performance Tapering, perhaps, for peak performance, something like that. I don't know. I have the first edition. It's been a while. Somebody borrowed it, never brought it back. I highly recommend. His last name is Mujika, and if I get a chance, I'll do a book review on it and actually give you the correct title. And if I remember, I'll put the link in the description of this video. A great book. It's endurance-focused. He's an endurance-focused researcher and coach, but it still was the first book to really highlight, sorry about that email, to highlight this, how to set up a taper properly. I've always been interested in decay rates of performance. How fast do you lose strength? How fast do you lose endurance? As a strength coach, that was something I was interested in. Well, how much lifting do we need to do? How, when I'd work with teams, how much time do I have before I need to hit another heavy day, right? And that's why I was interested in these decay rates. And there's some pretty cool studies back to looking at, the birth of TRIMP, and all these different TRIMP is a way of setting up training. And anyway, maybe I'll get into that in another video. But I wanted to review this article and also talk about a taper. So in Mojica's book, what I originally had in my first version of my book was a intensity stays roughly the same for 7 to 14 days. So, and this is thinking endurance, but I'd applied this to weightlifting as well, and had seen success with it with some adjustments. And then the volume is what would taper off. So intensity might drop a little bit, and I'll kind of give you what it would look like in weightlifting, the way I've done it in the past. And then the volume would drop off the 7 days before, maybe 14 days before a competition, 40 to 60% in an exponential fashion. So, the curve would be here rather than like a step down, okay? And so this article, looked at the available research and said, well, number one, is this intensity understanding correct? Should we drop intensity? Should we increase it? Leading into the last 14 days, is the volume drop appropriate? So 40 to 60% was the general guidelines. How many days out? And then a cessation period. So a cessation period. There we go. Too much coffee. And so, period where you don't lift at all. That's a common practice in powerlifting, that maybe the whole week before a meet you don't lift. Is there a difference between the different lifts? And again, there's only 7 studies here, and so let's keep that in mind. But the general consensus of this review, and again, worth your read if you're a strength coach involved with sports of any kind, especially barbell sports in this case. But thinking how it applies and it overlaps with the endurance world, is that the general recommendations of this article were very similar to what I just said: 7 to 14 day taper. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about what's how do you determine which one. 7 to 14 day taper, 30 to 70% drop in volume. Again, I'll talk about how do you determine that, and then keeping intensity maintained, and that's roughly over 85%. And then if there is a period where you don't have any training, because I'm going to say that word wrong, I don't know why that's so hard today. It would be roughly 2 to 7 days out where you don't do any type of training. So over a 1 to 2 week period. Okay, I want to make sure I got all that. So in other words, the way this would look is, and by the way, the model in this review of the article is available, either the exponential or the stepwise was shown to be effective. I particularly like the exponential, but my exponential sometimes looks like a little like a stepwise. And so again, how would this look? Let's talk about this. First of all, how do you determine when to start a taper? What I would say, let's say you're a weightlifter or a power lifter that's only been lifting for 8 weeks. You may not even need a taper. You just plow right into that first meet. You might have a taper of a half a week. In other words, your heavy day was on Friday, for one of the lifts, and Wednesday, and maybe you just pull down the volume a little bit those days. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. And again, if at all, weightlifters typically, I'll do like a mock meet, just so they understand how the meet will work and get them used to it, and they'll ramp up to maybe 85%, or their openers, which is commonplace, which could be the same thing in a beginner. And that's it. That's their taper. There isn't anything in their squat work. I might squat them all the way to the meet. I mean, it just doesn't matter as long as they're not sore. And the training isn't ridiculous. We're not doing 4 sets of 10 before the meet. But if it's a strength focused day, they may not be needed. Okay, I'm not saying it isn't. But it may not be. The more trained the person is, the more chance for accumulated fatigue. So somebody who trains a really hard cycle for 12 weeks and is an experience, and I mean by really hard, like they're pushing it. They're trying to set PRs along the way. They're pushing their squat numbers. The training volume is fairly high. They may need a 14-day taper, and I'll talk about though how it might relate to the barbell sport in a minute. But a 14-day taper or a 10-day taper, I'll tell you kind of what I've adjusted over the years, from anecdotal experience. Kind of how that looks. But what I would say with barbell sports, and the recommendation is article 7 to 14 days, just to keep in mind, the more trained you are, the more recovery you're going to have. And so I would kind of rest in that 7 to 10 day range. Over 14 days, especially if there's no training, you will start to lose strength gains. In the sport of Olympic style weightlifting, even powerlifting to some degree, maintaining some sort of technical proficiency is also going to be important. Now, I have seen this kind of really cool phenomenon over and over again, where after a meet, and a week of just what I call bro lifting and just non-structured lifting after a meet, individuals will come in at least the first 1 or 2 sessions come after that and be really snappy. Now, they aren't as strong, but they're, I'm talking about Olympic style weightlifting. Like the snatch looks good, the technique looks good. So, again, they always told me, well, maybe I should let them rest a little bit more, right? And maybe there's some fatigue clearance going on, right? I mean, it's just an interesting kind of delayed response, and that's why I've tinkered with the tapers over the years. So 7 to 14 days, exponential or stepwise. Again, what that would look like is you might have what I've traditionally done is I will do openers on Monday if there's a Saturday meet. And so the intensity there is fairly high, depending on the individual, 85 to even 95% of their max potentially, in the snatch and clean and jerk. And I did adjust that over time. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then over time, over the course of the week, then the intensity would drop a little bit. So I would do, like a 90 and 85. And then the day before the meet, we're still lifting, but like at 60%, and the volume basically they just warm up. Okay. The midweek lift, if there's 1 or 2, would be 85%. The snatch would be from the floor to maintain technical proficiency, and the clean and jerk would be some hang position or even powered if I thought they could make the transition between power and a regular lifts if they're proficient in both, just to spare their legs and start to get their legs back. But there wasn't a lot of volume there. So what I mean by not a lot of volume, there'd be a 40 to 60% drop from day 1 to day 2 midweek, and then by the end of or 40% likely, and then by the end of the week it'd be a 60 to 70% drop. So there's rapid drop in volume throughout the training week right before the meet on Saturday. And some did better with that than others. There's Dane Miller, who's a much more accomplished weightlifting coach than I am, made some cool observations about the high-level Olympic level, like world competitors, Olympic medal winners, and how they would train and come back in the training hall after the day of the meet and hit numbers that are very similar. And so, we're talking about the freaks there, though, right? And who knows what the pharmaceutical situation is, but even if it is clean, they're freaks for a reason, right? And so we kind of got to look at that and say, well, that's the elite of the elite. It's like saying, hey, it's all play basketball like the greatest NBA players of all time. Well, that's just not going to happen. That's why they're the greatest NBA players of the time. We're not. And so that 40 to 6% taper over the week could look something like that. I found with the clean and jerk, I actually would have people hit their last heaviest clean and jerk the Friday before the next Saturday, where the snatch that could hit a heavier one, like the opener day, let them maybe go a little bit heavier, just because while there's more power involved with the snatch, it's not as heavy. There's not as much load, especially in bigger athletes. So like an athlete in some of the bigger weight categories, that would have more of bigger loads to carry. If you got somebody that's clean and jerking 200 kilos, having them do that 7 days out might be a little bit too much. And for some guys, they might be able to handle it, and some they can't. But the majority of them found that keeping the clean and jerk at 10 days and the snatch at 7 days was it produced better results for me. Squat work, hit some heavy 90% doubles or triples, hit heavy 90% singles as 2 or 3 sets that Monday before the meet. Still hitting heavy loads, but nothing to failure. All quality work. It's just heavy. Volume builds and volume kills, and that's what we've seen in the literature here as well, and I've seen this over time. Is it's the volume that you have to wield the most careful, because intensity without volume isn't that big of a deal. Okay, now you can overreach with it. There's a classic study years ago by Fry that 20, I think it was 20 by 1, like maximal leg extension or something. It was pretty harsh. But it's the volume that kills. It's still the volume that kills. If you do a heavy single, it's not going to be that big of a deal. If you do 20 heavy singles, that's the issue. It's the volume that is the problem. Or not the problem. It's just how you have to wield it. And so exponential or step taper, 7 days out is from, most athletes I deal with are intermediate, I would say, beginning or to intermediate. Everybody thinks they're advanced, but they're not. And so that would be and that falls within the endurance parameters of 40 to 60% volume drop over 7 to 14 days. Same thing. The higher the volume coming in and the harder the work cycle coming in, and the more fatigued the individual is, the more taper might be required. And that's why I said for most people, it's going to be around 7 days in the barbell sport, and even in the endurance sport. In terms of taking complete time off, in weightlifting, I mentioned before, I don't like that just because it's so technical to take more than a few days off, or to take I like people lifting before the meet. When we go to these national meets, they'll lift in the training hall, even if it's just a light warm-up session before the day of the meet. I think that's really important to maintain technical proficiency. In powerlifting, it's not as important, but it's still important. So again, it would depend on the athlete. 2 to 7 days. Well, 7 days could be somebody who's really pushing hard in big numbers. They may need a complete rest after taper, or probably more likely is just a really aggressive taper, still staying in contact with the barbell, but not grinding on it. Again, there's a pharmaceutical issue here. So that's, there's a lot of things in play. These are just parameters. My recommendation is in powerlifting, as it isn't as technical. I didn't say it wasn't technical. And the loads are going to be heavier, and you have really finicky lifts like the bench, right? And seemingly, even though the article points out there seems to be no difference in the available evidence between the deadlift and the squat and bench in terms of recovery, and some would argue with that, and some deload the deadlift a lot longer. Some sort of aggressive time off is a better idea in powerlifting, is what I'm getting at, for those that are well trained. And that may be just a complete week off, or a half week ooff. You won't lose the technical proficiency. The body's just hammered and beat up and tired, and then come back and have a great meet. So this article was for powerlifting, and I would agree with that 2 to 7 day complete off training approach before a meet. And it depends, and that's the tapering in and then having this time off. So you might taper in for half a week and then take the rest of the week completely off. And I think for a powerlifter that would be appropriate, and that's shown positive inputs. And when I say positive output here, we're talking like 2 to 5%, maybe 6% in some cases bump in performance in one or all of the lifts. So that's significant. 2 to 6%. It may not seem like much, but those of you who lift and compete or are coaching, that's a big deal. That's the difference between last place and first, and even 1% is. So tapering is an important strategy. Okay, and make sure I hit all the highlights here. Again, a good article. Again, keep in mind there's only 7, and this is a hard thing to do this type of, there's not a lot of this research out there yet. Some of it's case studies that have been kind of peppered into this review, but the articles that are used here are, with actual study participants. This is one thing I do want to mention while I'm just double checking and make sure I hit everything here, is that keep in mind how important taper is in traditional like strength training research. Many times you might see a study that has 8 weeks of training and then just measures back squat strength. Well, at week 9, they measured back squat strength, but they had no taper. And so they carried all the fatigue from 8 weeks of training into that last week. And so what you might be getting is a masking of the actual strength gains that occurred in that program by fatigue. But if the authors would have tapered for a week, and some studies are doing this, I've seen this, right? It's a good idea. They tapered for a week after 8. Maybe they measured at that 9th week, but then they had to deload the 9th week, or a taper, basically, right? Deload's a taper, kind of the same thing. It's an organized, deload, and then measured on that 10th week. That would be more appropriate when we're deciphering whether programs are quote unquote good or bad when it comes to strength and power in particular. And so just kind of keep that in mind, how significant a taper would be even in just research looking at general strength and power studies. All right, intensity wise, like I mentioned, keeping it flat, something I do early in the week. I don't want to pull the intensity out too quickly. For powerlifting here, again, that time of not lifting 2 to 7 days, obviously the intensity would disappear altogether. But in like sport like weightlifting, I think it's appropriate to maintain that intensity a little bit longer. I mentioned doing 85% of maximal loads or 85% of the power clean in 1 RM. Not necessarily their full 1 RM, obviously. They'd be maxing out their power clean on a Wednesday. But bottom line is keeping the intensity high, keeping the squat intensity high going into that last week, which is under 7 days at that point. And so I think, not just I think, but observations from working myself, but also just looking at the research literature, they correspond very well to keep the intensity up in something like a squat for an Olympic style weightlifter. And if we're thinking about other sports, like say you have a soccer player and you're like, well, should I keep the intensity numbers up? And there's a big competition at the end of the week, and this person's been strength training consistently and so on. Hit some heavy numbers, but don't give them extra volume. Don't dose them high in volume. Remember, it's the volume that builds and the volume that kills. The intensity is going to hold what they have. And so, hitting like a couple heavy doubles or a heavy triple, not to failure, like 2 to fail, 3 to fail, that's going to be valuable and maintain their strength and actually produce potentially greater performances in speed and strength and jumping than would be just to pull the rug out from them and say you're not doing anything. So I'm talking about just general strength and conditioning. The study did mention, or this review article, did mention this, and I played around with this before a little bit, this phenomenon of kind of ramping up the volume in an overreach week. And then tapering hard. So, if you look at the fitness fatigue model or the GAS model, general adaptation syndrome, supercompensation is ideas that we have a depression in performance when there's some sort of stimulus that causes fatigue, but then there's a big supercompensation rebound, right? And the idea here is that if I really depress, right, with a lot of volume in this really short burst of volume, and then kind of let the gas pedal way off. So now I'm going to deload and taper aggressively. I should get even a greater supercompensation. And there's not much done with this, but the little bit we have says that this could be promising. What I would highly recommend though is some experimentation be done before. You don't want to try this out into a big meet. And that's what I would say about tapering in general. You can use your deload cycles during traditional training to mess around with what is a good taper for you. And if you're a strength coach and you got 40 athletes, well, same thing. You're not, you're shooting for the middle. Obviously you can't, it's going to be more difficult. And I say you can't, it's going to be more difficult to build individual tapers for everybody, but you can at least kind of shoot for the middle, right? Olympic style weightlifting, a little bit easier to start to build a playbook for each person, knowing, based on their weight class, based on their, who they are and how they recover and how good their nutrition is and how good they manage their sleep and how much their life stress is and how long they've been training. Are they a master's athlete? So on and so forth. The master's athletes might require a lot longer taper. That, by the way, I've seen that, right? And that makes sense. The recovery is reduced as we get older. So you talk about 7 to 14 days or 7 to 10 days. A master's athletes might need to taper everything, all 3 major lifts, what I would say the major lifts in Olympic style weightlifting, squat, snatch, and clean and jerk, out 10 days. So not just the clean and jerk, like I mentioned before, with heavier lifters, but all 3 be a better idea. And maybe some straight up time off for those masters athletes, depending on how old they are and how good their recovery is, might be appropriate. Obviously, there's a lot, here's the word of the decade, nuance in this. But these, I think the guidelines outlined in this article, and I'll leave a link for it, in the video are a great place to start if you're trying to figure out what the heck to do with the taper. And then you can tinker from there. So I highly recommend this. Again, I think I've said this 3 or 4 times now, or maybe it's the 3rd time, I don't know. There's only 7 studies that are the primary studies talked about here with some case studies thrown in. So keep that in mind. But I've seen this in my own practice and from Dr. Mahika's book on tapering, working with elite rowers as a strength coach, not as their rowing coach. All these different athletes, I've seen this played out to be a really good place to start and a good guide. And in thinking about, like I mentioned, Coach Miller's observations with, some of these high-level athletes, how it could be different. So if you happen to run into one of those athletes and coach them, you might find their tapers a little bit different. Or they could still be a high-level athlete and require a tremendous amount of deload / taper, okay, organized deload. I can't, say enough how important that individual component is as you work off of these guidelines. Okay, that was a longer video than I thought it'd be, but again, I get excited about this topic. I think it's a very important one in a variety of reasons, both for tapering to perform better, manipulating that taper to perform better, but also, kind of understanding the decay rates of some of these qualities, at least when we're talking about barbell sport in this case. And how long you have before you start to lose performance gains. There was one study that was cited in this article about 14 days, which is what we commonly, the 2-week kind of barrier of that's when you're going to start to lose strength gains, especially if you've been doing nothing, okay? And so that's not a taper, but just straight out not doing anything. You got about 14 days, and then you start losing, between 2 to 7%. I think was cited in this article. I think it was a little bit higher than that actually. I'm going to say 7%. I could be off just a little bit, but in that range, enough, obviously significant. And so that gives you kind of some parameters to work in. 14 days is too long for complete off time. Intensity saves. So maybe if I just did, at the worst, I just did some, kept my intensity through 14 days up and cut the volume, I probably wouldn't see any decrements in performance. I don't know if that'd be an optimal taper, but it could be a good one. It just depends on what you had coming into that taper period. If you were getting crushed and then, this 14 days was needed. So again, a lot of variables here, but I know I'm talking in circles at this point, but a great place to start, a great summation of the available tapering research in barbell sport with people that actually trained. And then I would highly recommend Mahika's book, which I'll put the link to the bottom and do a book review on in the future. All right. I'll see you in the next video. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Lots of videos on a variety of topics, exercise, sports science, nutrition science, and training science. And starting to put out more in the coming weeks.